And I was reading this, and it was in today's gospel. So for the folks that went to Mass, this might be the second time. So a reading from the Gospel of Luke. Jesus said to his disciples, "Be merciful, just as your Father is merciful. Stop judging, and you will not be judged. Stop condemning, and you will not be condemned. Forgive, and you will be forgiven. Give, and gifts will be given to you. A good measure, packed together, shaken down, and overflowing will be poured out onto your lap. For the measure with which you measure will in return be measured out to you." The Gospel of the Lord. I'll go through some of the procedural things that we can talk about, but I'd like to talk about marriage, because before we can talk about nullity, we have to talk about marriage. So, I wrote it down. These are key things that we have to make sure we understand, right? What is marriage? So, it comes from Genesis. It's scriptural. It comes from Genesis. It comes from John. And it comes from Mark. So it's not something that we just came up recently with, right? So we know that it's part of Scripture. What I'd like to do is have somebody read, I think the sponsors here, you guys have a good idea of, you guys use the Catechism of the Catholic Church, correct? Okay. Mary, who voluntold, has the Catechism of the Catholic Church in front of her.
The matrimonial covenant by which a man and a woman establish between themselves a partnership of the whole of life is by its nature ordered toward the good of the spouses and the procreation and education of offspring. This covenant between baptized persons has been raised by Christ the Lord to the dignity of a sacrament.
Big words. Big words. So here's what we'll do. I actually have, as deacons, we're allowed to witness the marriage. So who would like to volunteer and pretend that we're getting married? The question before the consent. This is the actual official book that Monsignor uses. We have to use this, right? So we say, Mark and Wendy, have you come here into marriage without coercion, freely and wholeheartedly?
I have.
Okay. Are you prepared, as you follow the path of marriage, to love and honor each other for as long as you both shall live?
I am.
Okay. This is the nice part. For the bridegroom, Mark, I take you, I,
Mark, take you, Wendy, to be my wife. I promise to be faithful to you in good times and in bad, in sickness and in health, to love you and to honor you in all the days of my life.
Thank you. And Wendy, I'm going to ask you to read the other one that's also valid, where the
Okay.
bride says.
I, Wendy, take you, Mark, for my lawful husband, to have and to hold from this day forward, for better or for worse, for richer or for poorer, in sickness and in health, to love and to cherish until death do us part.
Excellent. Thank you. And you have been married. Yes. Thank you. Very good. Excellent. Okay, why did I do that? Because I wanted to set the stage to make sure we're all on the same page. The note down there is the Catholic Church has always defended the dignity of marriage. Every marriage, sacramental or not sacramental, is considered valid, and we'll get to that. Every marriage is considered valid, period, until we get to here's the reasons why they may not be valid, okay? When does a marriage begin? Okay, it's really at the time of consent. The priest, and I'll show you a diagram of what the priest does. The priest doesn't marry you. You know that, right? The priest, and there's a witness, doesn't marry. The bride and the groom, the male and the female, are the ones that pledge that covenant. I promise to love you. That covenant is binding. You're promising to each other. And the priest or a deacon or a lay minister is just witnessing. Okay? The two of you, or man and woman, joining together, promising each other that you will love each other and stay together. Actually, there's no word of, is there a word of love here? Yeah, love and honor. Yep, that was used. Yep. But we also asked the following questions. I was trying to get to the next point. The next question is very important too. Besides that, are you prepared to accept children lovingly from God and to bring them up according to the law of Christ and His church? That has to be asked. Otherwise, it's not a valid marriage. So that actually happens before the consent. So, sorry, I skipped that one. Okay? So there are a couple of questions. So three things. The following questions can never be omitted. Are you prepared to accept children lovingly from God and to bring them up according to the law of Christ and His church? The second piece is, I, Mark, take you, Wendy, to be my wife. I promise to be faithful to you in good times and in bad, in sickness and in health, to love you and to honor you all the days of my life. Okay. So, have we determined when marriage begins? Okay. So, when when the consent is accomplished, the marriage has begun. If you get married, if I come in, I'm getting married to a Catholic, and I say I do, and I'm in front of that priest, that marriage is still valid. Okay? Now, we can talk about sacramental later on, but that marriage is still valid because I said I do. Now, for marriage, there's the second part of marriage, right? We forget that. What's the second part of marriage? How do you get children? How do we have children? You have to have relationships. I know. Sometimes we forget that we reverse the situation. But typically, you get married first, and then you have your relationships, and then you have your children. That's the sequence. That's really the sequence, because consummation has to be part of the marriage. The marriage may have begun, but a marriage may sometimes be invalid because there was no consummation. Okay? And consummation, everybody understands what consummation is, right? Okay, good. We don't have to. Okay, good. Okay, now we're going to get into some legal stuff, canonical stuff. 1057. But by the way, any questions on what we just covered, the first one? Okay.
The consent of the parties legitimately manifested between persons qualified by law makes marriage no human power is able to supply this consent. Sorry, the white glare is on the screen.
Okay. So there has to be consent of the parties. That's number one. Number two is matrimonial consent is an act by the will. Our will, free will. That's very important. You have to have free will in order to have consent. What's the next part? Man and a woman. Has to be a man and a woman. We all agree?
Yes.
Okay, thank you. Mutually give and accept each other through irrevocable covenant. It cannot, what? It cannot be, you cannot take it back. Right? Yes, go ahead, Mark.
So back to number one, though. So this is canon law. So in number one, where it says qualified by law, they're speaking about canon law.
Canon law, and we also follow civil law, and here's why. Because we are bound, even though we're separated from church and state, there are civil laws that we observe from a canon law standpoint where we cannot allow them to get married. For example, in civil law, even here in Georgia, you cannot marry your brother or your sister, right? You cannot marry somebody that you adopted. Civilly, you cannot do that. Canon law also says the same way. That's what it means. I just gave you some quick examples. The tribunal, the precise focus of the tribunal is on consent of the parties at the wedding day. Only at the wedding day. Okay? Everything that happens afterwards is a different story. Only at the wedding day. Okay. Now, here's the challenge as an advocate and somebody that, and forget about being an advocate, just being a human being. I have friends, right? I have friends that talk about this. And I cannot, yes, there is the law, but we also have to be human and say, you know, the people that I'm working with, my clients, parishioners, friends, families, they have feelings. They have issues that they were traumatized. And these are real feelings, right? We cannot forget that. I cannot forget that. Even as an advocate, we're supposed to just think about the law. But the reason why I'm talking about making sure we treat the next person without judgment, loving them, and really hugging them and say, you know what? It's not the end of the world. We're here. I am here for you. I am here to journey with you. That's what we cannot forget. Okay? There are laws, there are explanations, but again, the humanity, the love, that is what we need to always remember. Okay. Next, please. I think this will answer a lot of your questions. Canon 1055, Section 1. I've summarized it. Has been raised by Christ the Lord to the dignity of a sacrament between the baptized. Okay? There are only two requisites for a marriage to be sacramental. Okay? Both parties have to be baptized, and there is a valid celebration. Doesn't have to be if a Baptist and another denomination so Baptist, Methodist, that's a sacramental marriage. What is a valid celebration? They go before the justice of the peace? That is a sacrament. So a lot of people don't realize that. Okay? The order is not relevant. So if two unbaptized persons or people get married and sometime after the wedding they get baptized, their marriage becomes sacramental at that point, from the moment they were both baptized. And we'll get into a lot of the exceptions that happens. Okay? Marriage between two unbaptized persons or one baptized or one unbaptized, they're called natural marriages. Okay? We acknowledge that as a marriage. That is a valid marriage too. Okay? So, why am I spending a lot of time on this? It's because we have a lot of misunderstanding, right? Oh, that's not a sacrament. What makes it a sacrament is because of the baptism. That's what makes it. So, who would like to read something about what sacraments are all about? If there's anything that I want you to remember from this presentation, it's this page. And there's really only three things, or one thing that I want you to remember out of everything. What did you learn from Deacon Claro? That marriage as a sacrament is free, fruitful, faithful, and total. There's 3 F's and 1 T. Free, faithful, fruitful, faithful, and there's total commitment. FFFT. Okay? So what I did is, all the things that we did, a sacrament of matrimony, especially in the Catholic Church, has to have a recipient, right? Meaning, all persons who are not prohibited by law from contracting marriage. There are some natural laws, again, that we talked about. That applies. Each spouse must be a baptized man and a woman if we're talking about Catholic Church wedding, canon law. Okay? Properties. We talked about essential properties. There's 2 essential properties of marriage: unity and indissolubility. That's what that promise was. Remember, Mark, Wendy, what you were talking about? You wanted to be united and indissoluble. which in Christian marriage can be obtained by a special grace. That's what the sacrament is, right? So I'll make it easy. Or who would like to read it?
Sacrament is a visible form of invisible grace. Traditionally, sacraments have been understood as outward signs of inward grace instituted by Jesus Christ.
But really what I wanted to point out is that the sacrament is a visible form of invisible grace, efficacious sign of grace instituted by Christ and entrusted to our church, which are God's masterpieces in the new and everlasting covenant. Okay. Any questions on this one pager? So you notice I said minister up there. It's the spouses. Where did I get that? Catechism of the Catholic Church. Okay, 1623. So it's not, so a lot of people say, oh, who was the minister? Well, it's really the man and the woman. The priest was the witness, or the deacon was the witness. Okay. Okay, the other thing is the spouses are contracted before the local ordinary, pastor, priest, or deacon, delegated by either of them who assist before two witnesses. Again, references under those canon laws. Okay. Now, let me ask you maybe a question. If a priest who's not assigned to St. Peter Chanel married you, is that a valid one?
Yeah.
You sure?
Better be.
Well, first of all, Monsignor will not allow somebody that to come in and marry you without, there has to be an express delegation. It actually has to be written, and there's a document that says, I, Monsignor, pastor of St. Peter Chanel, allow Father Javier to marry this couple. Without that, guess what? Invalid. Any questions? Because this is really it. This is the whole 15-pager on what marriage is all about. Okay? The effects we talked about. Remember, any sacrament, it has to have the recipient, somebody receiving the sacraments. What are the properties? There are elements for the good of the spouses. It says there, good of the spouses, and procreation and education of offspring. Education doesn't mean formal. Just make sure that we educate them in the faith, right? So whenever I baptize the children, which is my favorite sacrament, baptism of infants, I always look at the godparents and say, are you sure you know what you're talking about? Are you sure you're really doing this? And by the way, 529 is done, and so I make a joke and say, have you provided for them? But that's not required. So the matter and form is the I do by which the spouses indicate their mutual consent. That I do has to be there. That's why when the priest sometimes says, I can't hear you. I can't hear you. So when you say I do, you really mean it. Okay, any questions before we get on to the next slide? I think we have enough time, and I'll speed it up. I have to go through this because you won't understand the rest of them if we don't agree on this. Matrimonium in firi and matrimonium in facto esse. Latin, right? Firi this is the marriage as it comes into being. It is the bride and groom's exchange, what Mark and Wendy did at the wedding. We call it at the time of consent. That is so critical, right? The next one, that is the marriage as it is lived out. After the marriage, they go home. They live as husband and wife. It is the lived experience of the parties in the life of their union. Now, why am I pointing this out? Because the tribunal's work, all the work that they do when it comes to dissolution and nullity, you'll hear those two words, has to do with the first one. Only the first one. Okay? I'll pause. Any questions on that? Yes, ma'am.
So, generally on the wedding day, everyone's in love and everybody's happy. And so, in general, they come, willingly. But if things change, you're saying they don't take that into account? Like,
Not necessarily.
if there's abuse or
or there's?
Not, well, there are some. It depends. So now here's where the whole it depends. One thing I love with Catholics, I was born Catholic, baptized, grew up. One thing I've really only realized recently, maybe in the last year or two, is you've heard of the Catholic yes and. Have you heard of that? Yes and? Okay. Not yes but, right? There's always the yes and. Who wants to talk about the yes and? Okay. So yes, but there's also, because remember, God is love, right? If God is love, these are the things that God has, so here's a good example. We have the 10 Commandments, right? You heard the homily, for those that heard the homily of Father Tamaru. He was talking about the 10 Commandments, right? Here are the laws. Here's the Old Testament law. Well, what did Jesus Christ do when he came? What did he say? I came not to abolish the law, but to fulfill the law. Well, where is that fulfillment? Beatitudes. Beautiful, right? Here's the law. I can be that's why he said that. The Pharisees were observing the 10 Commandments. Awesome. But did they have humility? Were they helping people? Blessed are the poor in spirit, for they shall see the kingdom of God. What else? There's eight of them, right? Who can Google it quickly? But it's so beautiful. It is so beautiful, isn't it? Because you have the law, you can observe it, but you're not following what Jesus said, what Jesus really lived. And that's why he came to us. And the way he came, he did not come as the king. He came as a servant, right? Isn't it so beautiful that our God came in to suffer for us, to teach us love, to teach us compassion. That's really what this is all about. There is the law, but there's the beatitude, how we live our life. Why did I point that out? Because that is the essence of what we're all trying to accomplish. There is the law. Yes, we understand the law. You have to have laws to have justice. But you also have to understand compassion. And that's where we're going to jump right in. So now we're getting into the nullity process. There's really only 3 things. Technically, there's only 2. It's called administrative, quasi, and then judicial. Okay? So now we're getting into what nullity means. So this is a dissolution. The administrative portion is called a dissolution. And there's a difference between dissolution and nullity. These are the items that fall under the dissolution or administrative process. Okay. What is Pauline privilege? It's basically, what it's talking about here is unbaptized. One remains unbaptized and the other one becomes baptized. Okay. The next is Petrine. Petrine is appeal to the Pope. So it's paperwork we're appealing to the Pope. Who can invoke the Petrine privilege? Basically, it's possible to dissolve. It says they're possible to dissolve a non-sacramental marriage when the requirements of this privilege do not apply. The dissolution must be requested from the Holy Father. It actually goes to Vatican. The third one is dissolution. Impotence, for example, non-consummation is subject to dissolution. Okay? What else? I did not list all of them, but I will point a couple of things out. So you had a question on what are those legal things, right? So first is prior bond. We talk about prior bond. Ligamen. You cannot be married twice. You cannot be married at the same time. There's no such thing as being married all at the same time. That doesn't work. So there's one that happens, there's a valid one, and then there's another subsequent one, so we need to determine what that prior bond is. Now, what about the things that we talked about when the church, or from a tribunal standpoint, we agree with civil law? Insufficient age. You can't marry under, in Georgia, I think it's now up to 16, I don't know for sure, but I think that's where it has been raised to 16. Holy orders, priests, deacons, permanent deacon, for example. So if my wife passes away, I cannot marry. I will have to remain unmarried at that point. Okay? Abduction, you cannot kidnap somebody, marry them, and say that's a valid marriage. It happens, by the way, outside of the United States, that happens a lot. We deal with it a lot, especially coming from South America. Affinity or adoption. Affinity, brother, sister, first degree. So we agree with that. But what's been confusing is legal law says that's an annulment. Legally, you can annul that. That's where that word came from. So everybody's asking me, where this annulment come from? Because I said, because it does exist. From a legal standpoint, you can actually see what's been, they do have annulments here. Civil law grants annulments to exactly what we talked about. But that's not the same. We call it a dissolution for that portion of it, right? Ordinary process. This is where most of the nullity cases that we really work on. Before that, let's go to the briefer process. This has been in play since it's back, who's the Pope? John Paul, JP2, and before him, Pope Paul VI. So that's been in play. We use that. The briefer process is when basically the petitioner is somebody that's filing, the one who files for the nullity. So there's two words that I will introduce, petitioner and respondent. Petitioner is the one that signs the paperwork that I would like to file a nullity. The spouse, I will still call them the spouse because they have not been granted the nullity, is the respondent receiving that petition. So the briefer process is used, and this has been reiterated by Pope Francis, because there are a number of nullity cases where the petitioner and the respondent basically said, yeah, I kind of agree. When I said yes, I really didn't mean it. And this is when you're talking about like, well, we're gooey-dooey, lovey-dovey, dovey-dovey. Well, you can simulate. There's such a thing as simulation, right? So those are when things come in. And by the way, I just want to point this out because we've always been, do you have to love the person to get married? No. Thank you. And 40% of marriages outside of the U.S., they meet the first time and they get married. Especially prevalent in Africa, where we have a growing Catholic population, and they never get divorced, by the way. So the first time they see each other is when they get introduced. Second time they see each other is when they say, I do. Is it a valid marriage? Of course it is. Of course it is. Because you don't have to love each other. Shocking?
You have to promise to, you just don't have to be in.
Yes, I promise to love you. I don't need to be in love with you. Right. And I'm open. There's a couple of ands there, right? So I promise to love you, and I'm open to children. And open. That doesn't mean that you will have children, but you're open to having children. The next question is, what was your intent? Right? So we talk about intent. Well, okay, the third one there is documentary process. So this is where some of your questions come in, right? I'm Catholic. I got married, and we were both, I married another person, a girl. We got married in Hawaii, on the beach, in front of the minister of, he got his commission from the internet. Is that a valid marriage? Yes? Catholic, got married on the beach? Has to be in the church. As a Catholic, we have some good things and bad things, right? Good thing is the faith, the church is protecting us from things that we may not understand, right? It's a Catholic has to be bound in marriage with the opposite sex. They have to get married in church under a designated authority. Okay? So destination, so I always hear this from my friends. Oh, Claro, could you come? We have a destination wedding. Oh, you mean a party? It's not a wedding. I keep telling them, you're Catholic. It's not a wedding. Now, get married in the parish that you're in, and then we'll have the party. So that's okay. You can still get married. You can still get your blessing there. But the marriage has to happen for a Catholic inside the walls of the church.
So
Yes,
if
ma'am.
you're Catholic,
Yep.
you don't get married within the confines, within the walls of the church.
Yes.
It's not a valid marriage?
You can petition for, well, you can petition for lack of form because technically it is a lack of form. Okay, so good question. There was a couple that when we were going through this, they looked at each other and they looked at me and it's like, holy cow. We got married in Aruba under the moonlight on the beach and we're Catholics. Does that mean it's not valid? I said, well, you can petition. If you don't want to continue, you can petition for a lack of form because it's not a valid marriage.
But it's valid.
It's valid sacramentally because they're both, yeah, of course, they're civil. Again, two different things, right? Yeah. According to the state of Aruba, licensed through Aruba, they were married. Church of Elvis in Las Vegas. You have a lot of people going there. Is it valid? According to the state of Nevada, it's valid. But according to us, it's not, right? It has to be, especially if you're a Catholic.
But if they're both baptized, it's still sacramental. Is that
If
correct?
they're both baptized, it's still sacramental, yes. Yes, you have a lot of baptized folks going in, and yes, it's sacramental because they're baptized.
The valid and sacrament are two separate.
Yes, one can be valid, the other one can be non-sacramental. Remember, marriage, it's a natural marriage. It's either sacramental or a natural marriage. Those are the two. Confusing, right? Because we hear a lot of, and this is what happens when we hear or we spend a lot of time with I call it Hollywood or social media. There's a lot of blurring of lines, right? Like children, for example. Well, we were open. So an example of a case is we were open to children. And then you ask, so when we get to the actual review, you ask the respondent, well, I was contracepting and I really didn't want to have children. Can that be nullified? Yes. Because this person said yes, but actually did not want to. They promised that they were open to children, but this person was not open to it. Why? Because rightfully so, she had other things going on. Again, not to condemn this person, but this person had a very valid reason not to do it. She wanted to graduate and earn her MBA.
So if one or both parties are not open to children, then it's not a valid marriage.
Well, it is a valid marriage. Every marriage, so this is something you have to remember. Every marriage is valid. The reason why you go to the tribunal is to prove that it is invalid, the nullity. that what they said yes to wasn't really yes. So that's the whole difference. Every marriage, whether sacramental or not, is considered valid first. So by law, in fact, the next slide, if we're finished with this, oh, these are types of invalidity. Okay. So no, we can go, unless you have any questions on this part.
One last one.
Sure.
Sorry, go ahead. With regard to the children, sorry,
Okay.
with regard to the children, if they say, yes, I'm open to children, earlier we had said it means open to children and willing to raise them, agreeing to raise them according to the law. So if, can that part be split? Say the person, when they're getting married, says, yes, I'm open to children.
Mm-hmm.
And then they have children, but then we're not raising them Catholic. The person does not any longer agree to raise them Catholic or following the law. So does that meet any of the?
It's called disparity of cult. So there are things. So again, every situation is different. I can come up with a lot of these, doing this for 10 years, but you have to prove it. See, the burden of proof is always on the petitioner and or respondent. All of these things we can do, right? So I always say when I'm trying to help a client, I said, we can throw out a couple of these, but we have to prove it. Because what we're trying to prove is the invalidity of your consent or whatever happened that we're saying it's invalid. Because the law, canon law says, all marriages, sacramental or not, are always valid. So first of all, let me acknowledge your pain. Let me say what you're saying is totally understandable, and you're not alone, and we're here to accompany every person. Let me say what is factual, and let me say what we're experiencing too. What is factual is it does hurt. One of the things that I always have to explain is the process of nullity is not a paperwork process. So that I can say in general. It's not about proving one is right, the other one is wrong, because it's a journey. The process of nullity is really a ministry. The process, and for those that would want to be an advocate, I encourage you, it's a ministry of compassion and understanding and healing. Every time I have a client, or every time I reach out and I have a new client, I always tell them this is going to be difficult, but part of the healing process is this journey, and I will make sure that I'm there, and I will help you and guide you through, and I will have my hand out for every person. That's what I do. I can't speak for all the advocates, but I can speak from a ministry standpoint, especially as a deacon. So thank you for sharing that. I know it's tough, but we're here for you. And on the flip side, there are things that so I've been doing this for 10 years now, right? So one of the things that I'm starting to observe, and one of the reasons why I continue to stay on this ministry, maybe not for long, but one of the things that I'm starting to see is we're evolving too. Now, I'm not saying that we're changing positions, but here's the beauty of being Catholics again. Yes, and. The yes, and is because we have acknowledged the tribunal. The Catholic Church understands science. What science has brought into the equation, why I talk about that, is the whole psychology of trauma. We understand, we have a much better understanding. Through this process, we actually engage psychologists and psychiatric cases, right? Because what we're finding more and more, especially with all the events that have happened, there's such a thing as PTSD. There's such a thing that, it's not, so when somebody says, we don't consider what happens afterwards, Well, not necessarily, because if that person cheated, what was his childhood like? What was his family background like? And if that's the case, did he have the capacity or she have the capacity to understand fully what they were getting into? Or did they have this, what we call lack of discretion? Incapacity for discretion. So let me tell you what most of the cases that we're going through right now, right? And I'll use some technical terms here. Incapacity, grave defect of discretion of judgment. Okay? Lack of sufficient use of reason. You don't need to write this out. But this is the reason why you want to speak, and I encourage you, if you want to help the person, don't talk to them about this. Ask them, give them my card. Okay, well, first of all, for the sponsors, you're supposed to go through Margaret. That's the process here. Go to Margaret, and Margaret will come and see me. But for the others, that's why you have deacons. And that's why we do this ministry. Talk to us. You do more damage, and I hate to say this, some of us, because of we want to help. All of you, the reason why you're here, why you're volunteer, well, this is a vocation for some of you. You're doing this out of love because you want to help people. That's why you're here. You are so compassionate. But sometimes when we talk about things that we sometimes don't really understand, we give them false impressions. So I really ask each one of you, see me, or see Deacon Joe. If you would like to see the opposite sex female, there's Mary, but go to Monsignor. Monsignor understands. He's the one that basically assigns us to cases. But by the way, by law, by definition, okay, Monsignor, sorry, but advocates, the reason why there's 120 advocates in the Metropolitan Tribunal is you have the right as a Catholic to seek us out. You have the right, okay? So Monsignor wants to understand, especially if you're going through OCIA, because he wants to make sure that he understands it. But one of the things, any questions on this? Because the next part is really what we're talking about. Okay, so I prepared the brief, and on the next the part that I want to point out here is the reason why we don't make promises is because we really don't know what's going to be the outcome. I never say this is a slam dunk case. Anybody that you hear as an advocate that says that, run away. Okay, there's no such thing as slam dunk. There's no such thing as easy. There's no such thing as, oh yeah, this will take 2 months, 3 months. No. Any advocate that makes a promise is not a good advocate. That's for sure. Okay? So that means that they don't know what they're talking about, and they have no right to say that.
So I think I heard that the process can be different from diocese to diocese, right?
Depends on the state, because now with USCCB, there's more uniformity. But yes, there have been changes, or there have been differentiations. But think about this. The canon law has not changed, at least since the last time it was revised was 1986, I think. Don't quote me on that, but I know that was the last time it has been revised. So they're not supposed to, because there's such a thing as canon law. But yes, some of the processes may be different, to your point. If they're following, because remember, we belong to one apostolic Catholic church. We are supposed to be doing it under the auspices of what the Vatican says. That's why we have the Pope. The person that's in charge of creating that can be an executive, judicial, and legislative is the Pope. But he cannot create just laws. I don't want to get too deep into theology, but I just want to make sure that that's clear. But yes, there have been differences. The next page is confidentiality, because I think this is important. Okay, we're bound by strict confidentiality. That's why you will never hear me talk to anybody here. I cannot even talk to Monsignor. We're not supposed to talk to our priest. deacons or members of the parish or any other parish about any of our cases. When I meet with the client and they haven't signed the paperwork, I don't take down notes. I crumple it and throw it out. We're not supposed to take notes. That's how confidential it really is. Okay. And there's penalties if we discuss this and tribunal finds out that we're talking about this. Okay. Any concerns? The only people that we talk to is the tribunal staff, and there's 3, maximum of 2. The judges, the 3 judges, if they call us, and we talk to them individually. We don't talk to them in a forum like this. That's how confidential it is.
The tribunal is not clergy, are they?
There's one priest. Not all of them are clergy. The judges, we have 2 non-clerical. And yes, although they are, we have a female now. I just met her.
How are they picked?
The bishop picks them, and they have to have a JCL. They have to be a lawyer, a canon lawyer.
Are any of them divorced? I mean, that's.
I know. No. That's a good. Yes. Not the judge.
On something you've never been through.
No, the defender of the bond actually is divorced. Yeah. She actually went through the process. Good question. Good point.
Clara, did the petitioner or the respondent ever go in front of the tribunal, or only you?
Okay, so the question here is, do the petitioners and the respondents go to the tribunal? When they are deposed, they go to, now, especially after COVID, they're required to go, but they're never asked to go the same time. It's always separate. Witnesses, by the way, are now being deposed. It used to be by phone. Now they are asked to go, so there are cases that I have, some of them are in New York, Texas, so they're asked to actually show up at that archdiocese. That's the requirement. Or sometimes if they're sick or the last resort is Zoom or whatever, social media that we could do. Yeah. So yes, that's one of the things that they're trying to make sure, because it's a court of law. Think about it. It's really a court of law. So so they will accommodate when people are sick and whatnot, but they can reschedule. Any questions on this? I think I wanted to make sure. I think we're way over, right? Sorry.
You got a couple minutes.
Oh, a couple minutes.
Great, you're like slaying it.
Okay, the last part, which I have, is what is not confidential. I think I already answered your question. The petitioner and the respondent have access. So I always advise the petitioner, don't start attacking. Be factual. Stay with the facts, ma'am. There's a commercial with that. Just write down the facts. I know you have feelings. There's things that happen. If it's not being asked, don't put it down. Just stay with the facts. Stay with what the questions are. And that's one of the things that I guide them on. Because one of the things that does happen, and by law it has to be done, is whatever the petitioner wrote. So that's one of the key things is, yes, respondent will see what the petitioner wrote down and vice versa. And when the judgment comes out, both petitioner and respondent will be able to see the summary, maybe not the details, but the summary of how the law was applied to the case, the testimony of the witnesses, and how the judges applied the law to that particular case.
So all that information can be heard in public?
Only to the petitioner and respondent and to the 3 judges.
What do they do in cases when the respondent is not a responsible person? Like, I think I would be nervous, again, like in situations where you're dealing with someone who's an abuser.
Mm-hmm.
Like, I don't know if that would make people
Yes.
say the truth.
We have, well, the truth, they're very good. One of the things that I realized, I just want to make sure I don't forget this because this is important. One of the things that we are really good at is we can figure out who's lying or not. They're very good. We use psychologists. And again, these are scholars that understand how to get to the truth and can pretty much, on the first time, you'll be amazed some of the first meeting or second meeting, we kind of have an idea already what's going to happen, especially because they're psychologists that are involved, especially when abuse happens. And there are, again, specific situations call for different actions, so we can talk about that.
How does that change the process then? If you know that somebody's lying, or they're incapable of answering you truthfully, whichever that, how do you proceed with that then?
Gingerly, and with lots of, remember, there's always two sides to an issue. How we determine it is because there are witnesses that you will, so both petitioner and respondent can provide those witnesses, and sometimes, I've always said, I thought I knew, there were two sides, but there's really multiple sides, and from those multiple sides, just like a court of law, you can see whether the facts are coming true or not. Remember, they're being deposed too. Not only do they need to write it down and respond, but they're going to be called and asked and said, help me understand this again. Maybe not in that way, but they'll, in a nicer way that I said it. But yes, we do eventually, that's the whole point of this case, is to get to the truth and nothing but the truth. Before you leave, I'd like to make sure that this paperwork is sent out. It was written by Archbishop. He's a former prefect of the Congregation of the Doctrine of Faith, a good German that worked for Pope Benedict. But it also talks about the pastoral care. I just would like to read it briefly. Last page. Clearly, the care for remarried divorcees must not be reduced to the question of receiving the Eucharist. It involves a much more wide-ranging pastoral approach, which seeks to do justice to different situations. So I thought that this was something that I read when I was first starting. It really gave me a better understanding, compassion of what people are going through. And it's important that we don't lose sight of that this is all done in love, in accompaniment, and this is not to isolate people, because that's not what we're here for. That's not what Jesus basically taught us.